Yes, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It gives me great pleasure to be welcoming you all here tonight for a reading of this outstanding and remarkable young writer. Thanks a lot to the Heimann Center for organizing this and for the university for providing these beautiful rooms for this reading. My name is Kai Kresser. I'm Associate Professor of African Studies at the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies over at Knoxhall. And I'll just give you a brief introduction, after which we'll hear around about 30 minutes of readings, and then we have time for question and answers. Yeah. So, Uzodinma Iweala was born as the son of Nigerian parents in Washington, D.C. Throughout his studies, after he received his A.B. from Harvard in 2004 and his medical doctorate just recently from Columbia University College of the Physicians and Surgeons in 2011. He's a writer and physician whose most recent work was a published account of the AIDS crisis in Africa entitled Our Kinds of People, Thoughts on HIV/AIDS in Nigeria, that was published in 2012. And this tells the stories of people who are grappling with the disease and its far-reaching effects. Iweala's first novel, Beasts of No Nation, was published in 2005 and was widely hailed as an astonishing, searing, and brilliant debut, which has been translated then into 11 languages. And having read it myself, I just want to say it's truly an amazing and sort of shocking narrative of a West African child soldier told from his own perspective, and a very fascinating and recommendable read. Beasts of No Nation received many awards, including the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, the New York Public Library Lions Award, and the Sue Kaufman Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In 2007, Iweala was selected as one of the Granta's best young American novelists. Iweala has also published numerous short works of fictions and essays, and has worked in international development on matters of health policy. His latest novel, Speak No Evil, from which he'll be reading to us just now, tells a series of interlinked narratives that explores the themes of choice, freedom, and what we must compromise to live in a secure society. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in listening to Uzodinma Iweala and his latest writing. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me and all for being here. It's always fun to come back to Columbia, especially this part of the campus where I spent many an hour studying, to varying effects, I guess, in medical school. So I'm gonna read from Speak No Evil, which is it's a work in progress. It's a novel that I've been writing for quite a long time. Actually, quite a bit of it written while I was in medical school on my BlackBerry. I would write on the subway on the way to class rotations and whatnot, and then also on the way back, which probably results in a certain kind of writing. But it is, as Kai said, a series of interlinked stories. It actually started from a collection of stories that I had been writing, and I suddenly realized that I was writing about the same thing in each story. Different characters, but pretty much the same theme, same topic. And I was also writing quite a bit about the city of Washington, D.C., which is where I grew up. So I thought, as opposed to writing these separate stories and publishing them separately, why not sit down and try to do the work to really link them together as one narrative? So I'm just going to do, I think, the easiest thing, which is to read from the beginning of the book. I mean, I've written the whole thing through. Obviously, I think there's probably another rewriting that has to happen. But I'll read to you from the prologue, and just to give you a little bit of background. This is about a woman who's maybe in her early to mid-30s, named Adelaide, or Adele for short, who's on her way back from work. In the novel itself, there are 6 different sections. Each has a different character. And all of these stories, as I said before, are interlinked. And you'll have to read the novel when it comes out, if it comes out, to be able to to figure out. I mean, that's, I guess, part of the fun is figuring out exactly how these characters are interlinked. But just very broadly, there are two major things that happen in the novel. One is a terrorist attack on the Washington, D.C. subway, and two is this young black man, maybe about 34 years old, who's released from prison after serving, I think it's about 14 years he's convicted of raping a woman. He serves 14 years for that and comes out of jail. And his relationship with a younger white woman of maybe about 17 years old. And then there are a series of other characters within this book. A U.S. soldier, military intelligence officer who is involved in torturing people, a Sudanese West African immigrant in the DC area who gets picked up in this whole extraordinary rendition thing and tortured, a young woman in her mid-30s who leaves a job as a producer for one of these DC political talk shows to go work on a campaign, a young teenage black kid, sort of upper middle class black kid in DC who's coming out of the closet to his family, a soldier who returns from Iraq, and then a married couple, young married couple who's just about to have a baby. So that's just the quick background. I think it's a lot easier to just listen to the story, so I'm going to stop talking and read. And then, if you have any questions, it's obviously much harder when you haven't read the novel or even seen the text, but if you have any questions, we can just talk freely about sort of the process of writing this and why. So I will start from the beginning, and this is a chapter called 1996. She was going to be late, not 15 minutes or half an hour late, but almost 3 hours late. The kind of I don't really care about my child late that made John chew his bottom lip and made Allison the solidly responsible, bookish 15-year-old from next door, who reminded Adele of herself at that age, except for her multiple ear piercings, and could be called upon to babysit in a pinch, $50 richer. Most of that money, Adele knew, was to punish herself for neglecting her daughter, not because she felt bad for disturbing Allison. The girl had little else to do during the summers, no school the next day, and from what Adele could tell, not much of a social life, except the one boy who lived opposite the street from them, and he was away. His family spent 2 weeks every other summer in Italy. Julia, the boy's mom, had told her, and John, when she and Sullivan appeared on their doorstep with a box of homemade welcome cookies when they first moved in just over a year ago. She'd forgotten Julia's husband's name, but who couldn't remember a boy with a name like Sullivan and the enduring awkwardness of pose, voice, and expression that 15 years old is when forced into social situations by one's mother? She chuckled to herself. Poor Elizabeth. If only she knew the torment that awaits her. Oh, Elizabeth, what terror, what joy. Her father's daughter right down to the chewing her bottom lip whenever excruciatingly angry, like she would be tonight, all 8 years of her suddenly woken from sleep against Allison, who would undoubtedly be reading a book, as they sat slumped together like some two-headed monster on that awful, awful brown leather couch that she had already mentally consigned to the basement once John was home from his trips. And they had had a chance to do the furniture shopping he had promised. She had made him promise they would do. Oh, poor Lizzie. No, Elizabeth, she remembered. Now that she was going into second grade, she had informed John, why did she only tell her father these things? That she needed to be more grown up with a more grown up name, hence Elizabeth, even if she could only barely list the name through the gummy space devoid of two front teeth. Oh, poor Elizabeth. Why had John chosen this week to go to New York? Why, when this was such a big couple of weeks for her, and more importantly, when Elizabeth was not at camp, not at her grandparents, and missing Daddy all the time? When's he coming home, Mommy? She'd heard that almost every day that week, as if asking would make the days go faster. Adele flicked her turn signal as she left the parking garage. This late, downtown, the streets were completely empty, as in no parked cars, no people, just the street lights and white lane dividers that often disappeared into the massive potholes eating the asphalt. They were so much harder to see at night, that much more jarring when the car rumbled over them. Easy, girl, she said aloud, as the steering wheel rocked. It was John's car, and she hated driving it as much as he clearly loved it. A BMW 3 Series, not the Volvo she was comfortable with. John had taken her car to the shop to be serviced before he left for New York. He was so sweet, so lovely, always doing things like that, going out of his way to make her life easier, even if it meant he had to wake up that much earlier to drop the car off at the dealer's before catching a taxi from there to the airport. God, I love him. No matter how much she said it, it never got old to say, I love my husband, I miss my husband, this car smells of my husband, I want my husband. She would have him, she knew, soon enough, after Elizabeth had enjoyed her fill and had taken him through all the things he had missed while he was away, including the unhappenings, like the fact that they said they would dig a hole to China in the backyard, now that they had a backyard, and had yet to do so. The thought of the two of them covered in dirt, traipsing across her new rugs, and yes, they were hers. She had bought them, all of them, with her own money from the rug dealer next to the Ethan Allen across from the Metro, was almost too much to contemplate because they would so do it. John could be so oblivious, so much like a little boy, especially with their daughter, finding no mischief too inconsequential. I really miss my husband. It hurts. What an irrational hurt. He was coming back sooner rather than later, and every part of him, from his thick brown hair to the beginnings of flab that he kept at bay with daily crunches, his large mouth and pale skin that he never allowed to get anything darker than pale after that one time just after they first met, when they went with friends to the beach and he came home furious, burning red. Had it really been that many years since their not so unintentional stumbling across each other was orchestrated by Lisa and Connor? He's like you, Lisa had said to her, all stiff and proper. They were on their way to class and they were more than a little late. He barely even looked at me once Connor introduced me as his girlfriend. Wait, what do you mean I'm stiff and proper? I should call Lisa tomorrow to make sure everything is set for August. Oh, Lisa. It had been so long. It had only been a year. It had been so long. She and Lisa had gotten pregnant around the same time, Lisa 3 months earlier, and both had had girls. Lisa giving birth to Claire first, and then she following up with Elizabeth. Thank God our daughters adore each other. Then Lisa had Siege. The girls tormented the poor boy. She remembered how Lisa was adamant that there not be another Connor Darcy, but men in their legacies. Suddenly, there was Connor Jr., CJ for short, turned by the girls in a fit of wonder at new vocabulary into Siege. Yes, August, she said. The White House loomed large in her rearview mirror as she turned onto 16th Street. This year, it was their turn to visit Lisa, Claire, and the Connors in California. I don't want someone like me, she had said to Lisa, conscious even as she said it, that she did want somebody maybe a little like her, a little conservative, a little Catholic, well, more than a little. It was so hard sometimes up there at Harvard, so lonely, arguing positions that just for having uttered you were made to feel dumb or worse, evil. The friends she had, the Lisas, the Connors, even if more able to find peace with the wider student body, still understood where she was coming from, the Catholic upbringing, a values-based approach to study, to the law, to life. It was Lisa who had been the one to rub her back and say, I know, after the abortion debates, the race debates, and the talks about homosexuality. But Lisa had Connor, even if there were times when Connor needed to be complained about. It was almost worse when Connor needed to be complained about, because then she could see just how much Lisa needed Connor, loved Connor, in some senses worshipped Connor. Could there be a man like that for me, she'd wonder when she saw them together. And it was so like Lisa to take it upon herself to find a man like that for her, because that's what Lisa did. If you find a problem, fix the problem, because otherwise it festers and that's how people die. My father is a surgeon, Lisa said, that's why I talk like that. Hence John and the Cape, one weekend in May when the water was still too cold to enter and they lay on the beach together, too awkward to say very much to each other, while Connor and Lisa made love in someone else's bed. They'd been out for too long, and John had forgotten sunscreen. He'd gotten so unfortunately red. God, I miss my husband. I should call Lisa. Once she got home, it would be perfect, given the time difference with the West Coast. Why am I on 16th Street, she mumbled, suddenly recognizing that what she saw wasn't the usual set of buildings for her commute. John hated it when she took 16th Street, but it was so much faster, especially because everyone took Connecticut Avenue during rush hour. It wasn't rush hour now, but it was reflex. Sure as anything, she found herself on 16th Street when she was late to get Elizabeth from her aftercare, because there were fewer lights, fewer cars, and really, once you got through the rougher areas, those older homes near the Carter Barron were quite beautiful. Shame, she thought, because she wouldn't have minded one of those large, brick, and affordable, but for the neighborhood. They would have been sorely out of place amidst all those black families, and anyway, she liked where they lived now just fine. The quiet slope of a street down towards Beach Drive and Rock Creek Park. That you could have neighborhoods like this in a city was something magical, something that the California sprawl she grew up in just couldn't match, though she still loved California. A different kind of beauty, yes, the Pacific Coast, right? The Pacific Coast. Sorry, I just lost my place. Problem with iPads. A different kind of beauty, yes, dry mountains, blue sea, but what awesome beauty. Oh, they would have such fun in those 2 weeks in August, to get out of the swamp when the heat was at its worst, spend a few days with her parents so Elizabeth could make magic with Grange and cookies with Grammy. And so Grammy could, when the men and her granddaughter were occupied, torment her with unsolicited advice and criticisms in that Rambler's kitchen where the linoleum and appliances were the same as when she grew up. And her mother's disapproval had aged perfectly, like the wine stacked atop the blue metal cabinets. Endurance was needed, but then she had run cross-country in high school. Those days had passed. Then the reward, a blissful 10 days at Lisa and Connor's house on the beaches north of San Francisco, where the girls could occupy themselves by tormenting Little Siege on the rocky beaches. Their husbands could contemplate steak, fish, shrimp, and other grilled delicacies, while she and Lisa giggled about the new projects they were working on. For Lisa, child number 3, and for her, child number 2, hopefully a boy for balance, who would most certainly not be named John. It was too Kennedy-esque. John Jr., John, no. She didn't even know whether it would happen. They'd already been trying for the better part of this year, sneaking it in on the mornings it wasn't their turn to carpool the kids to school, or after Elizabeth had slept. Then there was that blissful weekend recently when Elizabeth spent 2 nights in a row at Cassie's house, and she gave herself to John in ways they had fantasized about doing, but never done, because time and obligations perpetually went against their desires. And still nothing. I'm sorry. Her mother, excuse me. The tires screeched as she slammed the brakes and gasped. It had rained, stormed while she was in the office, and she hadn't even noticed. The streets were wet and oil slick, dangerous, especially in her husband's sporty car, and so lost in thought, she'd almost missed the turnoff onto Military Road. Adele, come on, honey, come on, get it together. There were a few cars approaching from the opposite direction, their bright white shown on the small fallen branches with their helpless green leaves caught in the illuminated parabolas of glistening asphalt. She could hear their tires on the wet ground, a sound she always loved, especially this time of year after those roving thunderstorms removed some of the heat from the air. Come on, hun, almost home. Yes, it would only be a couple more weeks, and then vacation. She had thought a number of times about canceling because this was an election year and August was a convention season. But faced with confronting Elizabeth, who'd been dying to see Claire or her boss, she had marched into her boss's office, holding her breath, still holding her breath, ever amazed by the massive cherry desk, the framed photographs of him with various presidents, world leaders, celebrities, and declared her intentions. He was reading some papers and didn't even look up when he said, "That's fine." So easy. Sometimes the folks at work were so confusing, a minute late to a meeting because you were doing something someone asked you to do, and they read you the riot act in 14 different languages. 15 minutes later, when they needed something, a speech, a 2-pager, and suddenly you were so loved. John never understood it, how she would moan and groan about the hill, about the office. He'd considered it briefly, of course. Everyone doing business thinks at least once about doing government. But I just couldn't deal with those people, he said. He loved her for it, she knew. You're going to fix America, Addie, aren't you? He was the only one she allowed to call her Addie, not even Lisa, and she'd known Lisa for so much longer. She loved this stretch of Military Road cutting through the massive trees of Rock Creek Park, just after the dilapidated buildings inhabited by all manner of unreasonable characters wasting their lives through the day, through the night, stoop-sitting, smoking God knows what, making babies that the rest of us would have to feed. There the music blasted loud, and she was sure the guns louder, and then suddenly the park, absolute quiet except for the sound of remaining raindrops cascading through full branches, and then onto the forest floor of wet leaves. When they'd first moved to the city, she and John would walk through some of the trails, slowly, both in sneakers and sweaters, feeling the fall bite on their fingers and noses, admiring colored leaves spread above them, scattered below them, holding hands or her with an arm through his, and the other palm rubbing her distended belly full of the one she now ached to see, to kiss on the face and forehead, and then put to bed, who would mumble something unintelligible and dreamlike as she curled into her stuffed animal, making mother who watched from behind a door ajar so thankful that in this world there were indeed the little things, making mother somewhat curious about the time that would come when that little girl would not fit into that bed, would test the confines of a mother's patience, and maybe even her dad's. One day she'll be married, and then there'll be grandchildren to tangle their fingers in my gray hair, to wrap their arms around my neck, and to smother and be smothered by. But I'm still young yet. Yes, still young, even if I don't feel that way. It amazed her how different she was from some of her classmates, from some of the other women she knew in this city. Yes, they were in their early 30s like her, but single, and on Fridays all dolled up, hair blown out, short skirts packed carefully along with high heels, so that work would easily be followed by a bar or a club with precious men, most of whom they would not talk to, and then Monday talk about wanting to have slept with, or have slept with, and then Monday talk about not wanting to have talked to. Exasperating yet sometimes intriguing. Yes, there was little envy of life in a world that consisted of dinner dates with exotic foods between two interested parties, and not pasta with butter, and a fight to get your daughter to eat something, anything green. No, darling, not lime popsicles or pistachio ice cream. And that silent evil eye meets, what do you want me to do? She's my little angel. Look, confrontation, when John let Elizabeth off the hook. He knew when she was gone. She knew that when she was gone, the very few times she had to travel, they ate pizza and they ate burgers and they ate that horrible honey glaze, is this really chicken, that John would buy from the Boston market on Connecticut, filling the kitchen with sauces that reeked, dumping out biscuits that she knew she could shine her dining room table with, that she secretly loved. That sound, that shaking, the wheel vibrated in her hands and then the car pulled to one side. No, this isn't happening. No, I'm almost home. No, you've got to be kidding me. At least she wasn't speeding. The tire hadn't burst and the car hadn't flipped. That happened to someone in their law school class before graduation, and his pregnant wife and his mother walked across the platform to collect his JD while his father couldn't compose himself enough to get out of his seat. The cheer was mighty then, as were the sobs. Why do you let that happen, God? But luckily for Grace, that was not her. Yes, as of this moment, Elizabeth still had a mom. She thought about driving home on the flat, but in John's car, his baby, he'd understand. But what a thing to have to come home to. Shredded tire, warped weir, and all the time it would take to make that right, especially when she wanted him to come home to her. No obstructions, jacket off, bedroom, and baby making. You can change a tire, Adele. Of course you can change a tire. What would Dad say? What would Henry say to a daughter, a sister of mechanical engineers who couldn't put the spare on? You're from California. You grew up driving, so just pull over and do it. Come on, honey. How horrible the slapping sound, that uneven bump, the shaking steering wheel, the cringe-inducing feel of imperfection. And then finally, once off to the side of the road, full stop. Maybe call AAA, but John didn't have a car phone, and besides, it would be ages before the tow truck gets here. No, just do it. Just make it happen. Just like this, in this skirt suit. At least the pumps were sensible. The warm night air rushed in and immediately fogged up the windows when she opened the door, and then that smell, that marvelous wet earth, wet leaf, wild weather swell, that was still, even after all these years, something alien to nostrils nurtured on desert air. All right, Addie, jacket off. Let's go. She could feel the moistness under her arms despite the cool after-rain air against her arms. The top she wore was one of her favorites, thin lavender fabric, button-up collar, but sleeveless, showing off arms that had yet to sag into maturity. Thank God for high school sports. She could feel the growing wetness in the fabric against her flanks, and in the parts of her shirt that now clung to her back. Fear? Yes, of course, I'm afraid. It's dark, I'm alone, and all the lights are dim, and the streets are empty, and the forests. But I'm not far from home. Come on, let's make it work. The trunk was a mess of John's things, cracked crystal CD cases scattered about, and then further, in a mess of athletic shorts and tennis shoes and balled-up T-shirts that had been there long enough to have lost the smell of a man. The horror. It was his car, though, his paraphernalia, his old water bottles, loose papers. Was that a greasy bag of some old lunch? He must have dumped everything back here before leaving me the keys. Better not to check. Better to resist the urge to pull the clothes to wash, trash the trash, and futilely stack CD cases that would scatter at the slightest turn. Just get what you need, the utility box, yes, it's there by the side, and with all the tools so pristine, unused, matte steel. Then lift the baseboard, and yes, there beneath, the black car jack and round spare with a yellow sticker warning that this anemic wheel was not meant for regular use. The air in that boot smelled of machine and rubber, and still, despite her husband's best efforts to mark it with his scent, new car. She wasn't with him when he picked up the Midnight Blue 3 Series just weeks after a signing bonus filled his account. But she was there at home when he took her down to the garage in that apartment building where they'd used to live, and proudly presented it to her with all of the little features, the odd offerings that boys salivate over and car magazines and impress each other with. That casual button flick and then magic when dropping a body off after golf. John. She smiled in spite of her anxiety, lifted the wheel carefully to keep just the right distance from her shirt, and then with a thud let it bounce and wobble its way to flatness like a large coin against the ground. Still no cars had passed, but no matter, it would all be over soon. The jack scraped metal against asphalt, into position on the ground, bolts loosened, and then the work, oh yes. Further turn those triceps and biceps, further aggravate the emerging carpal tunnel. Yes, the satisfaction of little old her making all that metal click and groan, and then rise, yes, rise, so that the wheel wobbled just a bit as it separated from the ground. It all smelled so pathetic, and in the low light looked worse, limp, abused, almost shredded as if having lost a battle against the road. And how hot it was against her hands. She couldn't see them, but after she'd removed the one wheel and replaced it with the spare, she knew that they were covered in that greasy black dust that made all mechanics untouchable and yet so desired. See, that didn't take time, easy as pie, piece of cake, c'est fini. Perhaps the only thing she really remembered from that pitiful semester of college French, taken because there was at one point a desire to walk the way of St. James from Paris to Santiago. She would have, except that her girlfriends thought it was more appropriate to spend summers at the beach. A rustling, then heart flutters, and then throat quickly dries. She turned her head this way and then that, still nothing on the road, no one quiet as kept. And then again, a rustling. She froze. Come on, honey, finish up. What could that be? Just a deer or a raccoon, yes, something like that. The park, the forest was full of them, so full that they often emerged to munch hard-planted flowers or topple trash cans in search of food, spread the embarrassing bits of life all over driveways. Let's make this quick. Car down, tighten the bolts, and then again the sound of crunching. Swallow, Addie. Oh, John. Our Father who art in heaven, swallow, breathe. Probably nothing, yes, nothing. Bolts tight, well, tight enough, as felt with that extra stomp of shoe against lug wrench. Always her favorite part when she did this with Daddy, all little and fascinated that his work was also the hobby that led him to always tinker with cars, sometimes to the nagging vocals of a frustrated mom. Daddy was an engineer, actually is an engineer. He would say because he was management. Now desk jobs, supervision, the pain, the perks before the gold watch. Pick it up, Addie. Those are footsteps. Are those footsteps? No. Yes. Yes, those are footsteps. Slow, prowling. Maybe help. Probably not. Then faster, Addie. Breathe. She felt it, and it hurt. A rock against her head, hard, breathe. The thought, she could almost read it in bright red, scrolled slowly before her. This isn't happening. I'm not here. Then nothing. What strange sensation, this smell of earth so close, and this sweet taste, sticky taste, unmistakable because it's unmatched. That taste of you, your very essence, your own blood. And then, of course, this pain in the head, pulsing no matter which angle the head is tilted. There are not so many angles. Forward, yes, that's it. Only forward into the leaves and the mud. Yes, a relief. And then more pain, a stretching, excruciating pull in the shoulders and the arms, and again the legs and at the hips. Oh, pain. Everywhere burning. And why so cold? Why so wet against my front? Why so bare this burning feeling on my back? And so free the air that tickles my rear end? Yes, pain. She had known pain before, many times, through various accidents, a broken clavicle here, and then labor. But this was forever pain, as if all of her being was this sensation, her thoughts lost somewhere therein, too. Am I naked? So hard to breathe. Yes, pain, I understand you now. Elizabeth, am I naked? Oh my God, what has happened to me? My head, I can't breathe. My back, can't breathe. This is blood. Where are my clothes? This isn't happening. I'm not here. Elizabeth, John, so cold, so very cold, so wet, it's raining, I am rain, I'm sun, I'm naked, I'm the earth. Is that light? Daylight and cars, my car, John's car. Where's my car? Walk, Addie. John? Why can't I walk? Am I tied? This pain. Why can't I move? John, can you help me? Can anybody help me? Can't breathe, must breathe. Our Father, John, help me. C'est fini. That's it.
Yes, thank you very much. We are open for questions and answers. I've got a few myself, but perhaps sort of open up the floor and please show signs of hands, and I'll take it. Would you like to start? I think there's a microphone available, actually. Do we?
Okay. Well, I'll stay here. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us. I hadn't read your book before, but I'm definitely going to read one of your first book now. Knowing that you went to medical school, it was kind of easy to see that come through structurally in your writing. But I was wondering how you feel that your concerns as a writer may or may not have shifted, having been in medical school and now afterward.
Wow. Oh man, it's like a real essay question. How they've shifted. I mean, I think for one, I mean, the most obvious thing, right, is that I think I'm just much more aware of people's bodies and how you write about a body. I mean, I think when writing my first book, one of the things that I did, because I had no idea what I was doing, was just, because I tend not to write very happy books, if you haven't realized, was there was a lot of violence and a lot of sort of trauma to people's bodies, and I had to go out and buy this book. I think it was one of these like how to write about trauma, basically, like bodily harm. And I think there's you know, and I felt in that particular book there was just a lot of, it felt more forced, and I think now just having had more exposure to people's bodies, right, and then on the flip side also just more exposure to how people are when they feel very exposed. Themselves and more vulnerable. I think it's just made I think my writing more aware of that. I don't know if that answers your question a little. I mean, in terms also of, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I wonder if because of just the way that you're schooled in presenting story while you are in medical school, like it's just a much more clipped format, a much more direct. I think I used to have work that was much more meandering in terms of its sentences, much longer, much just all over the place, which can be frustrating, but is its own form of writing, right? I think having to think in a much more constricted fashion probably does impact the actual structure of your text. Like you're just, the language itself is just that much more crisp, maybe. But I could be wrong.
Well, maybe I'll stick one question in here. I don't see any hand coming. I was, from the teasing sentence where you, and what you also said about the idea of a series of interlinking narratives, of course, this was basically one stretch of a narrative, I suppose. But I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more also about you know, movements, directions, and encounters that this sort of novel project also encompasses. And you were mentioning a few figures, like I think a Sudanese sort of. So of course also coming from, you know, from an African studies side, and being interested in these kind of, you know, trans-regional, transcontinental encounters. Will that be part of the novel, and in what way? Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that.
So, I mean, yes, in that one very specific story that is about, so I'll give you just a little bit more information. The story about the soldier who tortures and then this Sudanese guy who gets tortured is written in such a way that it's all in second person, and you don't actually know who's who when speaking, but you kind of have an idea. And the idea, I mean, like, is to, let me walk it back. I guess one of the things that I found sort of in growing up in Washington is just how similar a lot of lives are across certain income levels, right? And these are two folks in that particular story who come from basically a similar socioeconomic, well, some or have found themselves in a similar socioeconomic background. And I thought it was very interesting to try and play with that and see how much their lives could sound like each other's lives when writing about them if you deliberately try to confuse that. So yes, there is in that sense. But I think what I'm much more concerned with, and I had wanted, I think, for a little bit to write a novel without any African people in it. And this is kind of that, but of course I had to bring one back. Is to more look at like how different segments of Washington, D.C. Interact with each other. I mean, D.C. having changed quite a bit over the last 20 years, right, is a city that is still relatively segregated, where different people really stay in their different parts. And even as the demographics of the city changes, that still pretty much holds true, which is really, really interesting. And and yet, these different sections and segments of the city's population, whether you're in the city itself and you're talking about, sections of Northeast, like the one I sort of read about, where predominantly wealthy black neighborhoods like run right up against predominantly wealthy white neighborhoods, and there's very little, people don't seem to mix across those lines, to the areas that are now more changing, and that sort of will come later in the book. If you read later where, it's much later in time period and you see the city's changed, but again, you have these neighborhoods that have changed but still very much are almost like they're very clearly defined lines. I mean, I'm very interested in that dialogue, and how that dialogue impacts how you see the city, how a person sees the city, how the characters see the city that they live in. And then, also from the writer's standpoint, like how I see a city that I actually haven't really lived in since 2000, when I went to college, but that I still find very fascinating because of all of these changes and because of just the sentimental value it has and holds for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the lady first.
It's a quick question, but I just wanted to ask you about your writing influences in terms of sort of Western literature and African literature, and who are the writers that have really influenced you?
It's funny, I was just talking about that with somebody earlier today. In terms of African writers, I think one of the biggest influences is this writer Ayekwe Arma, from Ghana, who, I guess people would call an African modernist. I guess I would just call him modernist, or I would just call him a writer, or whatever. But his work, I think, is, very, very different from, I guess, what people are traditionally used to when they think of African writing, the Achebes and the Shoenkas. It just exists in a much more, I think, amorphous space. It's much more interior and much less about, at least the stuff that I was first introduced to, much less in my mind about directly speaking to, to sort of telling that story about a universal Africa that I think a lot of people would say some of these earlier post-colonial writers did, right? And the stories that he does write, so the books that he has written that do speak to that, for example, things like 2000 Seasons, are still very, in a lot of ways, like claustrophobic and interior, which I think you can probably tell from the way that I write, like I'm very much a fan of. The other thing that he does is he's just very wordy, and I know a lot of people don't necessarily like that, but I really love sort of like a very thick text, right? And like when you look at it on the page and when you read it aloud, it's just very heavy. And I like that presence in my head when I'm reading to myself and just on the page in front of you. And then in terms of Western writers, I was just saying that, like, I was in, I think it was my junior year of college, I took a playwriting course, and the teacher put on a BBC production of Beckett's play, which, I hadn't really read any Beckett until then, and that's completely changed the way that I thought about language. And from there, started reading people like Virginia Woolf and whatnot, and those non-African modernists, I guess you would say. I find myself in love with that sort of style of writing, and that, again, the interiority of their writing, and the, for want of a better word, just they're obviously very structured, but there is a very just a wide interior space, right? That the writing itself shows, like that the text itself shows, and funny enough, by being very wordy, like by constricting. I don't know how to explain this, so let me not sound like, but just in my mind, I'm not an academic, as you guys can tell, but like that the prose itself is very thick, and it constricts your understanding of, or it blocks out the rest of the world, right? But then the character's interior space becomes very much yours, and that I find really, really remarkable, and I think that's been very influential in the way that I try to write. I hope that makes sense.
So I'm also going to ask you about narrative technique, because you mentioned that later in the book you shift into second person when you're talking about the torture section. So what you read to us is, as you said, very tight and claustrophobic, an interior view, and pretty continuous in the way it narrates. But then we're going to get different characters, and it seems like you're going to shift to a different mode. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the architecture of the whole book, is it pretty radical shifts from one section to the other, and then it's a, I don't know what you would call it, a montage effect, right? Or how do the juxtapositions work of the different styles and different characters?
So that, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I think what I've been trying to do with this book is, even as the characters shift, I want the prose itself, and so even as the point of view shifts as well, that the prose and style to be relatively consistent, so that you don't get wild variations, and that there isn't, even if it doesn't move to first person, there isn't any first person narrative, it's just the second and the third, but you don't get any, there's no wild swing of language, it's that same sort of style consistently, where the thought is mixed with the descriptive prose, is mixed with dialogue, and you don't, like, you almost can't tell when you switch from one to one. But the point of view and the emotions of the person speaking, sort of, and the things that they see, and the way that they describe what they see, even if the language is consistent, the points that are made, I think, will give you idea of age, will give you idea of gender, will give you idea of class, or, you know, like, nationality. And that's, you know, that is the hardest part of writing this, is like trying to make it that consistent while still allowing for that much difference in characters' perspective, but that's the idea. I mean, that's kind of one of those things, I think, that there's no reason for it, except that I think it would be pretty cool, and like, it's a way of challenging myself to write a book. I think I've written a lot in the first person, and with that you can swing wildly, you can be very, very dramatic, and I think, again, a more constricted prose is something I think, for me, just from a writer's perspective, is valuable to learn how to do.
Hi. I don't know if you're practicing now, but I wonder if you could speak to the impact of the writing on your doctoring, and of writing on the subway back and forth from classes on the way in which you practiced medicine.
So I'm most definitely not practicing. I decided not to go to residency. I don't know that I can answer the second part of the question, but or the first part of the question. I mean, the second part of the question, I mean, for me, the writing back and forth on the way to rotations or whatever was really, I mean, it was really a form of escape, like, very, very simply. It was just a way of getting into a different headspace before having to go into doing something that was, for me, very mentally challenging, and then obviously, as is I guess, the practice of medicine, just very emotionally challenging as well. You know, and it was also that, you know, so going to school, right? You've got 15 minutes, and you have a chance to. I mean, it's also, you know, and just to be very honest, it's also a confidence booster, right? Like, you go into an environment where you're constantly doing things wrong, where you really have no idea what's going on most of the time. And like, this is the one thing that you actually have absolute control over, is whether or not you can get 1,000 words in like the course of a day going back and forth. You know, on the way back, it was a way of unwinding, and also I would say probably a way of chronicling what had happened during the day. And when I say chronicling what had happened, obviously not like a diary of, okay, I saw this patient, you know, with this professor, or this thing happened, but like the emotional reaction, taking that out of, you know, so if you come back really, really angry, you take that out of the context and put it in another one. So you write a character or a section of a story where the person is extremely angry, or you write a section of a story where the person feels very lost and very confused. And I think, in that way, it was a way of really processing a lot of the emotions that you're faced with when you're in the hospital. And then also processing the emotions that you see other people faced with, whether it's the clinicians or the patients when they're in the hospital. And like trying to access that point of view and understand it. I think that's kind of what that helped to do. Now, in terms of the way now that the connection of the writing and health work. So I live in Nigeria now, and I do a lot of work with the Ministry of Health, various projects. But I think the connection is more now just when you're at sort of like the broader public health level. There are just so many very interesting like national level stories. And that one is that, and funny enough, like the way that I feel like a country deals with at least the way that Nigeria is dealing with its health situation is very much influenced by a lot of the larger national narratives that we have. So for example, if you're up, one of the big things, right, the biggest issues now is polio in Nigeria. We're like one of 2 countries, I think, in the world that still has people who get polio. And a lot of that has to do with the cultural dynamics in northern Nigeria, like a lot of mistrust, a lot of belief that the vaccine, and like then a lot of political gain had by telling people that the people coming to vaccinate you are actually coming to make you ill, right? And that's part of like a larger national narrative that hasn't been resolved since the creation of the country and the weird amalgamation of this state from all these different cultural groups. The way that we talk about HIV/AIDS, which I talked a lot about in the book that I wrote, again, has a lot to do with sort of the larger national narratives and how we view ourselves as Nigerians. So, there's a lot just at that level. And then you also see it just down to the dynamics of how people interact with each other in the ministry itself. Again, you've got a national body that's composed of, at least the office where I work most closely with, a minister who's a northerner. His senior most assistant is a Southeasterner from my ethnic group. He's Igbo. Then you have other people from all, and like it just creates a very interesting dynamic where there's a lot that isn't said about what they're supposed to be doing and what they're not supposed to be doing. And I think that I find very, very interesting and lends itself to a lot of writing, both analytical and creative.
So, please.
Okay.
So Uzo was a student of mine at PNS. I knew him as a first-year student, a second-year student on the wards. And the answer to your question about his training, so another dimension of it is simply that you were able to see things that others couldn't see because they didn't have the command of language or the capacity to express what you saw. And so, but what Uzo was able to do with that capacity, in addition to the writing that we're hearing, is to engage his colleagues in seeing more clearly what was in front of them. So I know, because I was kind of your supervisor on this work, that Uzo and a colleague very methodically, carefully, gravely interviewed their classmates as they were going through clinical training in the hospitals and enabled their classmates, the other medical students, to kind of see more clearly what they themselves had been through, what the patients went through, being ill and being in our care. So, you may or may not call that doctoring, but I sure do call it that, in simply being a means of others to kind of grasp what it is their predicament has put them in.
Right.
And I sure hope you keep doing that.
We'll definitely do.
Well, I think this is a fascinating thought of how basically verbal sensitivity and expressive agency or ability, from your perception as a medical doctor, might assist one to be a better doctor. And so the interchange of, that was also the thrust of your question, I think, how these, how there is apparently a sort of real rich potential in that, and that might be a whole, a fascinating field to be explored from these different sides. Yeah, so thanks for that insight. We had one more show of hands here, please.
Have you read any reviews of your work, your writing, where the reader/reviewer interprets your work in a way other than what you intended, and has it changed how you reflect on what you've written?
I mean, I think everyone would like to get up and lie that they don't read the reviews. It's so not true. I read almost every review. The thing about like the way that people, unless, so I read almost every review, and I'll have something to say, like you'll get angry about reviews that are not great. I think with the HIV book, the reviews from the United States were very positive. The reviews from England were very negative. Negative, but I think, so I can get up here and say that, for example, when I was writing about HIV/AIDS, I was writing not about policy, which is what I think a lot of people in the UK wanted to see. I was writing about emotion, right, and like the national emotion that this epidemic has brought forward. But that's the HIV epidemic in Nigeria. But then at the same time, like the thing, and that's the biggest risk with writing, and also maybe the biggest reward, is that you write something, and like once you've written it, like, and you've published it, or you've shown it to someone. I mean, like what I've read to you here, it's for you to do with what you will with it. Obviously the reason why we all respond to different pieces of writing and writing that we really love is because it engages us and it does something to us very personally, right? So that you can pick up, I just finished reading War and Peace, which is a novel about nothing to do with my life ever, right? And yet it has everything to do with my life, and I can understand and engage with it because it's mine when I read it, right? And it's no one else's. My own interaction with the book, with the text, is my interaction. So in that sense, you have to just be very, like once you put it out there, once you ask for someone's interpretation, like it's not for you to really say how they should or shouldn't interpret. That's on just the larger level. I think on a more immediate level, I think when I'm writing and when I am working on something, there are definitely different sets of people that I show to. So there's a set of people that I show to who I know are just going to tell me that it's great no matter what, which I think is very necessary for you to keep going. There's a set of people that you show to who are going to argue with you, not on like the actual style of writing, but because they don't get what you're saying. They have a completely different perspective, and that's always really, really helpful because it helps you understand maybe what you're saying and how it's being interpreted and how you can say it better or clearer to bring people, like to get your point across if you have a point, or to make the story itself and the emotions that you want to put out clearer. And then of course, are the people who you show to who will just take everything apart and tell you, like both technically, and content-wise, like that you just need to do a different, better job, and that this is not good. But all I think are very necessary for the process. But once it's published, wrapped, bound, it's got the dust jacket on it. It's like, it's the most you can do, right?
I would perhaps like to pick up again on what you said earlier, on your interest in writing about the body, the bodily experience, and potentially draw a comparative point to your earlier novel on the soldier boy, where I actually thought, this was very, where actually bodily issues are also explored. So where I thought there's a very sort of, an ethical concern in a way, but it's not a moralizing writing at all. But what I want to point at is perhaps that there might be a continuity or comparative point in the concern with fundamental existentialist sort of experiences of humanity on the brink. When you also talk here about the experience of torture or the incapacitation through ailment and the bodily ailment. So that might be a sort of a topical strand or a theme for which there's some continuity, and for which also then the medical sort of training enables you further as a writer. So maybe you can comment a little bit more on that.
I think that's definitely true, and it also kind of goes to what Dr. Shannon was saying. I think, that, and funny enough, that was that project that we worked on with, so we interviewed 10 of our classmates, me and a good friend of mine and classmate, interviewed 10 of our other classmates through each of the I think it's like 10 or 12 rotations you do during your third year of medical school. And that was, funny enough, very much, like as much as it was about their own individual experiences, it was also very much about the experiences of the people that we were caring for as well. So that added another layer, I think, to something that has always interested me, which is, and maybe it's not so much with like a fascination with the physical form of the body itself, but a fascination with how people, I guess, deal with themselves in a certain space, right? And so and how you then define yourself within that space. So, in my first novel, it's a book about child soldiers in West Africa, in an unnamed West African country, and has to do with basically taking a child out of his regular context and putting him in another very brutal, like physically punishing one. And I guess the idea is to really look at how you construct yourself when everything you know, including that self, is threatened on a daily basis. I think the book about HIV/AIDS is in a lot of ways somewhat similar, although it's a nonfiction narrative, and it's based off of interviews, but it's really talking with people who, and asking them essentially that, to talk about that same question, that same theme, when that thing that threatens is very, very real, and very present in the society in which you live. And I think this one, this book, again, with the different characters and what they're facing. One of the main characters is a girl who gets injured in this terrorist attack and loses an arm. I mean, I think again, it's just like how does your sense of self change or adapt or deal with the threats to self? Which, I mean, I think it's probably something that you could probably say every book is about that in some way. Maybe I'm just more physical because I also like writing about physical bodies, and maybe that has something to do with medical school as well, having been exposed to physical bodies and on a daily basis for 4 years, and that, like, the very real threats that you see to people's physical bodies, and I think also from my own perspective, like, how do you cope, or how do you deal with a threat to somebody else's body, right? When it's not, I don't know if this makes sense. So it's not yours, right? It's that. Let me just. I remember I did a rotation out in on an Apache reservation. I think they rotate a group of students each for this primary care rotation, and one of the things I remember the most was seeing a woman who had had diabetes, who had had a number of surgeries, who had a hole in her leg, basically big enough that you could put your hand inside and you could see the titanium rods that they'd used to reconstruct her legs. And a lot of, there was this thing where it's like, you have that wincing reaction, but, for me, the next step is like, okay, how do I write about both my reaction and then also that person's way of experiencing what life is like now that has happened? And you can do that for the very physical, immediate form, and then you can also do that on, for the more interior space that people have to deal with. And I also like the interplay between those two spaces, both the external description and then someone's internal understanding of themselves now that they've gone through all that physical pain or that change. And I guess a lot of writing that I do now has a lot to do with that.
Well, thank you. I think we've explored quite a few fields. Perhaps a last comment just on the title, Speak No Evil, and perhaps then I think we should come to a close. But of course, that might be an obvious question that's not been asked.
No, so two answers. One is that there is a Wayne Shorter album, and I mean, I did this with the first book, and maybe I just have something wrong with me, but there's a Wayne Shorter album titled Speak No Evil. And actually the chapters or the sections of this book are titled after the different tracks on that song. There's 6 tracks: Witch Hunt, Fee Fi Fo Fum, Dance Cadaverous, Speak No Evil. There's one other one, Infant Eyes, and then Wildflower. And for me, like, each one of those tracks has a different sort of, brings out a different emotion. But then also, a lot of the other thing is a lot of this book does not have dialogue, and characters will get to the point of saying stuff and just not, and then move into another. Like, it will either move from them actually speaking into this interior space, as you could see happening with Adelaide in this particular story, or they just won't say what they're supposed to say, and the story has to continue without that. And I think that's a big part of what I'm writing about, right? Which is, you know, in a lot of ways, the way that we interact with each other, which is just like we refuse to take it to the next level, and we refuse to say what it is that we should say to actually complete conversations and move them along, and then everything is then subject to interpretation. And that's in the spoken word, and that's also in the actions that like our actual physical interactions with people, you know, and could in a lot of ways be sort of raised to the level of like the way the city interacts with itself. So that's where the title comes from.
Well, thank you very much again for your reading and this fascinating discussion. Well, thank you all for coming, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.